Hello, everyone, and welcome back to week 10 of Native Americans of North America and 340. We're all the way down here in week 10. We're going to be doing spring break is coming up here very quickly. Or we just did spring break, and we're doing Northeast. Presentations are going to be coming out real quick, along with your paper being due and your PowerPoint very soon. So be ready for that. This week we're going to be doing the Northeast. Let's check out the syllabus with discussion board and quiz and the paper. If you haven't already picked your group, probably now is a great time to do that because it's coming up real quick. So we're going to do that. Then your PowerPoint's going to be due next week. And then the week after that is going to be our in-class presentations where you'll get to share your research with everybody else. So if you haven't picked a group, please let me know soon who you're going to be doing. Okay. We're going to be doing the Northeast today, along with the rest of this week. We're going to be looking at the really old stuff today. But in general, this week, maybe some questions you might want to look at, think about this week. We're going to talk today about the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. What's it famous for and how did it change our understandings of early Native Americans? Next time, we're going to talk about the Iroquois, especially during kind of the American Revolution period. We'll talk about the Iroquois Confederacy and a guy named Hiawatha. Who was Hiawatha? What was he famous for? Describe in detail the social and political organization of the Haudenosaunee that he helped establish. We'll talk about that next time. And then on Friday, describe both the recent struggles and successes for Native Americans of the Northeast. So hopefully you'll find those in our discussions. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so without further ado, sorry, just a little bit of further ado. We'll jump right into welcome. There we go, the Northeast. So by now you kind of got a feel, hopefully, for kind of how we're doing this class, right? Every week we're going to a new geographic area. We're going to do the really old stuff, the colonial era stuff usually, and then kind of the more modern struggles and successes. And by this point, we've kind of traveled around, we've done the Southwest, we've looked at kind of the Northwest coast, we've looked at Mesoamerica, we've looked at Southeast, and we're starting to see some big kind of trends or some big ideas kind of cross all these different regions. What are we seeing so far? What are some things that you've seen? Kind of compare and contrast these different regions. A lot of diversity, right? And probably more than maybe before you knew, before you started this class, you knew about it. But I think a lot more diversity than most people know, right? The people that oftentimes we have a very Hollywood understanding of Native Americans, like the Hollywood Indian, in which everybody kind of falls into the Plains native kind of garb and way of life. And we see lots of different stuff. But what about similarities? Do you see any similarities? Lots of difference. Difference is kind of easy to see in some ways. What's some big overriding themes or similarities you see between these different groups? Yeah,
material culture being pretty much a big.
Yeah, right. Different stuff depending on if you live near the coast, you're going to be making boats, or if you're living in the Southwest, you're probably not. But like the idea of material culture and using the natural environment is pretty prevalent. Jeff, Sam. Yeah. This human environmental interaction. What about complexity? What do we see with complexity? What's the general trend with social and political complexity? Yeah. Especially with the introduction of what important thing makes society go, basically? Corn. Yes, corn. This is my thesis for the class, right? Corn powers everything. Corn powers the American native cultures. And just like we've talked about elsewhere, spoiler, it's going to be corn again in the Northeast, right? So let's see how we get to corn. All right, when we talk about kind of the different regions, right, we kind of critique this a little bit throughout the semester, but in general, we've been using this kind of culture ecology model. We've moved around. We've hit the Southwest, we've done Mesoamerica, the Southeast, Northwest, we're gonna do the Great Basin next week. So if you're doing Northeast, through Plains, Subarctic, Arctic, we'll get them all, right? But in general, we're talking about kind of this area this week, the Northeast. There's a lot of diversity, especially kind of once we get west of the Appalachians. Some people would call this like the Midwest and have like a separate thing. I kind of think that as well, especially when we talk about some of the continuities when we're going to talk about mound builders again, because there's a lot of mound building stuff up in this part of the Southeast, but also there's a lot of difference, right, between if you're living up here on the, the coast up here in Newfoundland or in New Brunswick or something, or you're living kind of in Southern Illinois, right across from St. Louis or something. A lot of difference. But in general, we can think about kind of how this place is. It's very different, I guess, from where we live right now. A lot of this, right, especially towards the coast, there's going to be a lot of marine resources, kind of this kind of low swampy area right near the coast. Then kind of the Piedmont, again, this is very similar to the Southeast, where you get this uplands, the Appalachian Mountains, and then kind of into the Midwest. Right now, if you travel this area, if you drove across the country, it would look like a lot of farmland. But prior to kind of 1800 or something like this, most of this would have been forested, right? And big forests, especially like large American chestnuts, deciduous trees kind of throughout. And it's a really well-watered, ideal place for hunting deer and planting corn and doing things like that, right? Abundant rainfall, lots of rivers and lakes, makes it easy for transporting goods. Again, a really an ideal place if you're setting up a civilization. Except for one thing, right? When we first talk about the earliest people in the area, one of the problems with this and with living up in this area is it would have been glaciers. Right, and this is actually the reason that if you look at the map. Anybody know what these lakes are called? The Great Lakes, yeah. And they were formed by glaciation, right? There used to be glaciers coming down through this part of North America. And as they retreated, they tore up the landscape and made the basins, which form not only the Great Lakes, but all these kind of lakes that you see kind of throughout here. And you can actually, when I lived in Illinois, you can actually see the line even today where the glaciers stop, right? North of the line, it's pretty flat and scarred landscape from the glaciers, and kind of to the south of that line, it looks more like the Southeast with kind of rolling hills and more varied landscape, right? But in those early days, when people first migrated, whether it was through this ice-free corridor or along the coast by boats, and eventually settled kind of in this area, they were really challenged because a lot of this was under ice, right? What's really interesting is we'll talk about a site, you'll have a Vail site in a second. People are basically living as soon as they get here, pretty much, right at the foot of the glacier, right? And this is going to be a really interesting area for people to live in. Lots of animals are going to kind of be there. There's a source of fresh water and things like that. But again, it is kind of this edge environment, right? We find a lot of these really early tools, things that look a lot like Clovis points. There's one here in New Mexico. And then we also find some maybe stuff that maybe looks even older, maybe some pre-Clovis stuff as well. So this is a really early stuff, kind of contemporary with what we see at Clovis, or maybe even older. And this is a map, series of maps, I guess, kind of showing you how over that time period, from about 14,000 years ago to about 4,000 years ago, the glaciers retreat. Basically, being down here 14,000 years ago, almost to where modern day Chicago is, or covering up Michigan or Detroit and Michigan, and then kind of gradually pulling back over the last 14,000 years until we get the Great Lakes that we see today. And we find when we look for these really early sites, right? We find oftentimes kind of, like I said, right along what is today present day lakeshore, right? So it makes sense. These are kind of going to be good marine habitats. If you're an early hunter and gatherer, you can fish, you can hunt. It's kind of nice. One of these really early sites, which is kind of interesting, is called the Vail site. It's way up here in Maine, kind of like in central Maine. It's an interesting site. And it's one of the earliest sites that we find where people are living in an area that used to be glaciated. Like they're kind of right on the edge. as the glaciers are melting and pulling back into Canada, they seem to be following kind of those glaciers and setting up their camps there. And it seems to be something different, right? While they do look very similar to Clovis, it seems like maybe they're being adapted for something else. Instead of maybe big game hunting, maybe they're used for hunting caribou, right? And this will kind of come up in a few weeks when we talk about the subarctic up a little bit further north. And so I wanted to show you just a quick little clip. Where is it? Michael Gramley. One of the guys who initially worked on this site. I'll show you a picture of him when he's younger. Can't find it. There he is. This is 1980. He's a little bit younger then. He was one of the archaeologists who worked on this site at Vale site. And so this is him now, a little bit older. But he's going to talk to you real quick, like 2-minute clip, about the Vale site and why it was historically important.
Specific talk about the Vale site.
The Vale site actually is one of 8 sites in a very small section of the remote valley in northern interior Maine. It's the largest of the sites, and they were all related. They were probably laid down within 50 or 60 years of one another. The Vale site, which was discovered by me in 1979, is noteworthy for being a large encampment where people dwelled for 9 years in succession, 6 families living in tents, a band, 6 families. But what brought them there is the most important thing. This was a dependable place to ambush caribou, and based upon where the ambushing spot was, the people then erected their camps downwind where they killed the caribou. These people were free to choose where they should live, and there was no one else around living anywhere nearby to tell them where not to live. Consequently, they picked a place where large numbers of caribou could be ambushed and where they could make an excellent living. We calculate that in the course of 9 years, they killed roughly 12,000 caribou, and which is a large number, many hundreds of tons of meat and bone. But in actual fact, this would have provided what was exactly needed by a group of 60-some people.
And what is the date of the Vale site?
The Vale site has been very accurately dated at around 12,700 calendar years before present. It constitutes the earliest site, perhaps, that we archaeologists will ever find in that part of North America.
Thank you. And next, we're going to talk about your work in Cumberland's. Thanks.
Cool. So tell me why the Vale site is important. Why are archaeologists interested in that place?
The earliest deglaciated settled areas.
Yeah, right. And it also tells us a little bit about subsistence patterns at that time, what people were doing. What were they doing at the Vale site? He told you. Yeah, ambushing caribou, right? And we often think of caribou as something more associated with like the Arctic or the subarctic, but especially during the glacier eras, right? That's going to be a prime area for hunting caribou. So a really interesting site, and it shows us that people are kind of moving on. They're not just hunting what we think of like as megafauna, but moving into hunting animals that we still even have today. Another one of the really early interesting sites, and it's even earlier than the Vale site, is the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter located in Pennsylvania. This is a map of pre-Clovis sites or Clovis era and before kind of sites, the squares being pre-Clovis, at least pre-12,000 years ago. And you can see they're kind of spread throughout North America. But the one, especially in the kind of Northeast, that's most famous and has been contentious over the years, people arguing, especially before some of these more recent discoveries have been made, is the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. So over here in Pennsylvania, right, just to orient you, we're down here in New Mexico. This is Pennsylvania. Sorry. So kind of down here in this bottom left corner down here. And if you go there, you can go visit the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, which is set up as a state park these days. I'll show you a video in just a second. Since we can't go on a tour of the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, we'll do the video tour instead, right? One of the really interesting things about the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter is that it's really old. It's pre-Clovis, at least that's the kind of supposition. And people have been working here since the late 70s, early 80s, trying to prove basically that there are people who live in North America before Clovis, and that it seems like maybe they're doing something a little bit different than we see at Clovis, right? Not necessarily the big game hunting, but something a little bit more broad spectrum in these kind of bottom layers, which seem to predate Clovis. Another really interesting thing about the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter is that it's been basically in continuous use since people rolled into North America, right? You can look at some of these earliest layers, and there's pre-Clovis layers, there's historic layers, of Native Americans, and there's kind of the early settler period, and then you even have kids hanging out here in the 70s drinking beer on a Friday night kind of life. So you realize this really interesting 14, 15, maybe even 19,000 year cross section of what life is like in rural Pennsylvania. So let's take a look at the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. We'll take a little tour with one of our tour guides.
Hey, Boaz here with Next Pittsburgh, and we're here in Washington County to go behind the scenes at Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. To show us around, we've got the director, Dave Schofield here. Dave, thanks for having us.
Oh, sure. Thanks for coming out.
So I see we're already standing in front of a little gate sort of fence, and we're going to get to go to the other side.
And take a little closer look. So we're under the enclosure that is protecting the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, the National Historic Landmark archaeological site that has provided evidence of people on this spot 19,000 years ago.
And so how do you know it was 19,000 years ago? Is that through, carbon dating?
It is. It's based on radiocarbon dating from from charcoal that's been recovered from fire pits here.
That's wild. And that blew people's mind when they discovered it, because they didn't think there were humans on this continent at that time.
Yeah, it was in direct opposition to the paradigm at the time in the 1970s that suggested people had only been in North America for about 13,000 years. The first excavation took place in 1973. By 1974, that first radiocarbon dates came back from the Smithsonian, and everyone was astonished, including Dr. James Adebasio, who was the principal investigator and remains so today. He expected evidence of the site going back maybe 3,000–4,000 years. This would have been really an ideal place to camp. So it faces south, so it takes advantage of the heat from the sun. It's high enough above the creek that they didn't have to worry about flooding in here.
Close enough to go get food or hop in a boat or something.
Exactly. And the overhanging rock ledge provided shelter from weather. You can see the back rock wall there. That's the depth of the site. But that overhanging rock ledge extended all the way out to where we're standing prehistorically.
So what can we see? I see there are a lot of little tags down there.
Yeah, all these tags indicate either a particular level of the site or where there's a particular feature. So one that I want to point out to you is over in this area. This little kind of saddle-shaped feature is a fire pit. It's half of a fire pit. That's a fire pit.
That's a lot of imagination. How do you know that's a fire?
Well, if you were up close to that, you would see little bits of charcoal and ash. But that's a fire pit that was constructed here at the end of the last ice age. So that is an ice age fire pit.
What's that, like 10,000 years ago or something?
More than that, so 11,000, 12,000 years ago. This area that you're looking at is what we call the deep hole. So because it's the deepest part of the site, it's where the oldest evidence has been recovered. One of the signature artifacts from the site is what's called the Miller Lanceolate Point. And I brought this is a cast of the Miller Point. That is a 14,000-year-old stone spear point that was recovered here. And when this was found in 1976, this was the oldest artifact to be found in North America, human artifact to be found in North America.
So presumably they would have used this to hunt whatever animals were living here back then.
Right, this would have been affixed to either a spear or a long dart that's thrown with a tool called an atlow. And that was the hunting technology of the time.
Wow, and so what other remains and pieces of things are you finding here?
So there were 20,000 artifacts recovered from the site. In addition to that, there were 956,000 animal remains. So,
Who is counting all this stuff? That seems like such tedious work.
well, it's important scientific information. And that represents 150 species of animals. So pretty much anything that was here over the course of those 19,000 years is represented here.
Are you finding evidence of things that are extinct?
The only extinct species from this site is the passenger pigeon. So this area that we're standing in right now represents the office space for the excavation during those
You
major.
can see the office space of the prehistoric humans who lived.
For the archaeologists that were studying the prehistoric people. But this was, at one time, the rock walls were lined with 1970s paneling. There were shelves and file cabinets. And right here, there was a computer terminal that was connected via acoustical modem to the University of Pittsburgh mainframe computer. This was one of the first, if not the first, archaeological site that used a computer in the field. They were entering data here on site that was going back to the University of Pittsburgh mainframe. That was cutting edge technology in the mid-70s.
Very cool. And so can you talk a little about how Albert Miller, this was his farm and he stumbled across this and realized he had something unusual?
In fact, I'm going to show you the location of that groundhog hole that he found right here in 1955. So November 12th, 1955, Albert Miller was walking through here. He saw the groundhog had excavated a fresh hole. And in what the groundhog had excavated were some artifacts. And so Albert knew that his theory that prehistoric people used this site was correct.
How did he even have that theory to begin with?
Albert was an amateur archaeologist and he knew what rock shelters were. So he went home, he got a shovel and a screen and enlarged that hole. And he found more. He found burnt bone, he found flint flakes. And when he got to 30 inches deep, he found an intact flint knife. So he knew he was right. And he was wise enough to know that he should keep quiet about it. Because if people knew that there were Indian artifacts here, it would most likely be looted and destroyed. So he covered it up, kept quiet about it, spent 18 years trying to find a professional archaeologist to do this profession. So in 1973, a new faculty member at the University of Pittsburgh, James Adavasio, was looking for a site to do a field school. And so in 1973, they did the first professional excavation. So you can imagine that the ground surface before any excavation took place would have come up right through here about waist level. And right where you're standing, Boaz, there was a fire pit that was still being used by the local kids in the 1970s. And so it had all the party paraphernalia from 1970s activity and the whole chronology of beer can technology. And that fire pit was excavated back to an 18th century level. So for the last 200 years of this site's history, this was the center of activity under that overhanging roof. So if you look at the profiles here and imagine that as a vertical timeline, if you were to look at all of the major world history events that we all learned about in school, like the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, the building of the Great Pyramids, the building of Machu Picchu, all of those things would be up near the top of our timeline because this site goes back so much farther.
Well, it seems like Meadowcroft in some ways is a time machine here. And here you have evidence of people living here, up to 19,000 years ago, but then you also have things that are more recent.
Yeah, so we tell that whole story from 19,000 years ago to the 19th century primarily, looking at.
And there's more of that if you're interested. You can see some of the other things you can do at Meadowcroft. Okay, we have a quiz question on this week on Meadowcroft. So somebody tell me, what is Meadowcroft Rock Shelter and why is it important? Yeah, it's pre-Clovis, one of the oldest ones. You know, it was found in the 1970s when the idea of pre-Clovis wasn't as popular as it is today. At least it's a lot more controversial. We got evidence of broad spectrum hunting. You know, 190 different species, 900 something thousand different animal bones, and basically being in use pretty much continuously from the pre-Clovis era to today, which is, you know, it's a really interesting, like the guy said in the video, a really interesting time capsule that you can take a slice of ground basically from, or core from the meadowcrop, and see basically all the major world events happening from the last 19,000 years. So that's kind of the really old stuff. And just to kind of, there's a whole bunch of these sites that we can find, you know, even really old stuff that's like Clovis contemporary sites. We do want to move ahead a little bit in time to the Archaic period, right? And this is kind of what we think of, at least, you know, any other geographic areas we've talked about, right? This is that period of intensification, of settling into the landscape, of still being hunter and gatherers, but really focusing, all the megafauna at this point is gone, right? You don't have those woolly mammoths or giant saber-toothed tigers or anything like that. People still being hunter and gatherer type people living in small groups, but really exploiting the environment in new ways, and not just hunting big game, but also starting to use those marine resources, right? The Northeast, if you've ever been there, it's a great place to fish, not only along the coast, where you can harvest not only fish, but lobsters and clams and things like that, but also on those inland rivers and lakes where there's plenty of things to eat. And also during this time, we see maybe some of the beginning of people starting to use plant resources as well. We'll talk about that in a second. Just like we talked about, we're not going to spend a ton of time on this, but like we talked about last week with the Southeast, 2 weeks ago, I guess at this point, during this time period, right around 6,000 maybe years ago, maybe a little after that, we start to see the beginning of a mound tradition, and we'll talk about this more in a second. And it's very similar to what we see kind of in the Southeast, especially, again, hunting caribou in the winter, using marine resources in the summer, and lots of different kinds of things. But about 3,000 years ago, we see the intrusion of Inuit people. Eskimo people is probably, you're more familiar with them, from this kind of area, which start to push into this area, you know, mostly following the caribou and hunting caribou. And so we start to see conflict between these groups. During this time period, during the Middle Archaic, about 4,000 years ago, it's what archaeologists have called the Container Revolution, right? Which seems like a kind of a silly name for it. But it is actually, you know, points to one of the biggest changes in lifestyle for these people. What do you think the appearance of these kind of containers? Some of these are, you know, presumably they had biodegradable ones as well, but we're starting to see pottery, starting to see earthenware and things like that. Do you think the significance of having lots of containers suddenly appear in your archaeological record, Mance? Sedentism, right? If I'm going to have all these big containers, especially made out of ceramics or stone, I definitely don't want to be carrying them around as a mobile hunter-gatherer. So that's one thing. What else can it show us? Maybe they're living in one place. What else? What are they putting in these things? Why the sudden need for containers? Food storage, yeah, right? It's like you've gone to the grocery store and you bought all this stuff and now you need to put it somewhere. Before, people were basically, you know, getting what they need when they need it, right? We're hungry, we're going to go out and hunt and see what we can find. This starts to show us that people are settling into one place. They're starting to collect things and store them for some amount of time, right? This shows like kind of a longer term cycle of subsistence. About 25 or 3,500 years ago, we see evidence of trade and kind of throughout the region, as well as trade beyond the region, right, into the kind of upper Midwest and into the South. And the beginning of some of these groups, which we can start to recognize distinct cultural or ethnic groups. We also see this kind of brownstone stuff, especially the kind of introduction of pipes, which is probably for tobacco, and one of the early crops cultivated in the kind of region. We see about 4,300 years ago, people start to mess with plants. Again, this is some of the stuff we kind of know today. Tobacco and sunflower seeds are probably the most common of these that we still use today, but things like Jerusalem artichoke, sumpweed, goosefoot, knotweed, maygrass, right? A lot of these grasses, which you can eat, right? And especially if you're an early farmer, this is kind of an interesting thing to experiment with. But, spoiler alert, by the time corn gets introduced about 1,000 years ago, 1,200 years ago, most of these become famine foods or kind of backup foods, right? Corn takes over. During this time period, we start to see the beginning of elaborate burials, especially within these burial mounds. People, especially elites, probably being buried, like we saw in the stuff about the Southeast 2 weeks ago. Buried not only just in these mounds, but with grave goods, oftentimes jewelry or these kind of artifacts like this one up here. It's kind of maybe a religious symbol, or even sacrifices of other people. Along with artifacts like this, you can see a lot of these. This is a pipe in the shape of a bird. Here's a human face, wolf or dog, maybe a bird. And again, it just kind of shows us some of the craftsmanship of these really early groups. As we move kind of a little bit further towards modern times, getting into what we call the woodland period, we see the appearance of pottery, not just kind of these gourd or stone jars. As horticulture, especially with these crops, becomes more common, people start to have more elaborate social systems, start to build bigger settlements, and invent the bow and arrow. Just like we talked about with the Southeast, right? This kind of reaches its height in these moundville civilizations, kind of in the Northeast, right on the border of the Midwest. This is like present day Ohio. And again, part of this larger cultural complex, it's not really separate from the Southeast, right? And when we think about different regions, oftentimes we think about this like hard boundary. But something very similar during this time period is going on here. The arrival of corn, especially during this time, along with beans and squash from Mesoamerica, probably, traded up the Mississippi from mound building civilizations who lived in the Southeast. And spread not only the agriculture, but kind of the cultural system as well. And again, if you ever get a chance to travel out east, this is Chillicothe. This is in south kind of east Ohio. It's an interesting place. If you go there today, it kind of looks like a golf course, with little rolling hills and mowed grass. But at one time, this was the center of mound building civilization in kind of this area, and drawing stuff from not just this region, but from all over, right? Mica from the Appalachians, shark's teeth from the Atlantic, copper from the Lake Superior region, flint and obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, right? Shells from the Gulf of Mexico, right? Bringing stuff from all over across the continent, and not only just stuff, but people and ideas as well. Yeah. And kind of at the end of the woodland period, right, something starts to change in this region, right? During this time, like I said, there's this continuity. There's lots of different like subgroups of mound builder kind of things that we can talk about, right? Whether it's Hopewell or whether it's, Cooper or whatever, right? But generally the same kind of throughout this region. At kind of the end of this area, about 480, something starts to happen, right? Especially kind of in the northern area of the mound building civilization. And if we look at a map, right, of linguistic groups, this is a map of different Native American linguistic groups. Presumably, this is right around the time of contact or during the colonial era. This area, which was kind of the northern part of the mound building civilization, basically something happens up here in which large groups of Algonquin speakers, who are basically the people who live in the subarctic of Canada, the Cree, Ojibwe, that kind of people, start to move south. People with familiar names, if you've ever lived in the Midwest, people like the Illinois, right? We got a state name then, the Miami, the Fox, the Shawnee, right? Seemingly groups of Algonquin speakers, somehow something happened and they start to move down into this region, seemingly displacing most of the people who lived here, right? And we see a continuity down here in the south where they don't seem to come all the way down here. And DeSoto, tromping around 1500s, sees Natchez mound building, going have the last vestiges of mound building civilization. But in the Midwest and kind of towards the Appalachian Mountains, during this time period, basically something has changed, right? About 3,000 years ago, there's these groups of people, whether it's through climate change, whether it's through tribal warfare or something else, seem to be moving south and displacing kind of people from this part of the land and really making it very different during the colonial era from what we see linguistically and culturally in the South. And at the same time this is happening, whatever happened to these mound building groups, the Algonquins moved down here, but a group of speakers, Iroquoian speakers from the southeast, which are, if you remember last 2 weeks ago, Cherokee or Tuscarora are southeast Iroquoian speakers, seem to move north. And these become the ancestors of what we know as the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee. We'll talk about them more next time, right? So by about 1000 AD, the Iroquois have moved up into kind of the northeast part of the US, which is present-day upstate New York, growing corn and building ceramics and basically kind of settling this area and becoming the dominant force in the region by the time the colonial era shows up. And that's where we'll stop, because we'll talk more about that on Wednesday. So we'll talk about the historic era and the Iroquois, the 6 tribes of the Iroquois next time. So get out a few minutes early today. That's nice. All right. That's it for today. Remember, if you haven't picked your group for your presentation and your paper is due on Friday. Please let me know. Also, if you have any questions about the paper, if you're like starting to freak out because it's getting close to the time, please also let me know and we can talk about it. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.